The Pete Podcast. Hey, it's episode 6 of the Pete Podcast. Welcome. So as many people know, Tom Blake served as the Member of Parliament for Carshalton and Wallington for almost 23 years, which is a pretty considerable length of time. And over those years, Tom was naturally very active in the local campaigns, but also held a number of ministerial positions during his time with the coalition government. And I was very keen to find out more, and so I was absolutely delighted when Tom agreed to have a conversation with me, and I hope you find it as interesting as I did. So here we go. This is the Pete Podcast with Mr. Tom Blake. Hi Tom, welcome to the Pete Podcast. Thanks for joining me. How are you doing?
I'm great, thank you, Peter. Looking forward to it.
Obviously, we are living in unprecedented times at the moment. How has it been for you the last couple of months dealing with the lockdown situation?
Well, I guess we're, as a family, quite fortunate, compared to many others, because my wife has been able to work from home. My daughter has as well. My son's on a gap year, which regrettably means that he won't be able to go to Kenya, which was what was planned amongst other things. And of course, I'm since December no longer the Member of Parliament, and therefore at the moment at least playing a much more domestic role in terms of cooking, cleaning, washing and doing the shopping.
Oh, okay. So I suppose perhaps you've got a few years to catch up on with things like that, perhaps.
Well, you're right. I mean, first of all, I've got more than 20 years to catch up on when it comes to not knowing how to cook. So I've done quite a lot of that in the last sort of 3-4 months, fairly successfully. And in some respects, I guess, because I was politically active for about 30 years, some catching up on sleep to do as well, which I think probably by now I've just about done.
Oh, great. And well-deserved as well. When you reflect back, because you were MP for Carshalton and Wallington for the best part of 23 years, which is a tremendous amount of time to be in one role, and particularly, with the intensity, and I'm sure you're going to explain, some of what that entailed. But when you reflect back over that time, what are some of the overriding kind of thoughts or emotions or memories that you have of serving, this local community?
Well, politicians have a very bad name. There's no doubt about that. But in my experience, really politicians, nearly every single politician I've met from all political parties are in politics because they want to make a difference and they think that they can help their local community. I think that's what the overwhelming majority of politicians go into politics for. And that's what I've tried to do when I was the Member of Parliament for Carshalton and Wallington, with a focus on really important issues that matter to local people, often more perhaps than what's happening in national politics, but things like the future of our local hospital, St Helier Hospital, things like can parents get school places in the local schools, and very often some very basic things like, is the refuse collection working? And those are issues which very often are the things that people get frustrated about, sometimes more so than, as I said, what's happening at a national level.
No, that's interesting, because I think that we obviously, a mere mortal like myself would sort of look at the role of an MP and just think, well, they've got the power to kind of sort it, but I guess it's not always easy as that.
No, I think that's a rude awakening, really, for every politician, particularly politicians who are in opposition, to some extent politicians who are members of Parliament who are in the party that is the governing party, and even for ministers in government, that you get elected with ambitions, but you then come across a machine or a supertanker which doesn't necessarily want to go in the direction you want it to go in. And even if you're on the bridge, the captain in charge, turning it slightly in a different direction is a huge endeavour. So I realised, I guess, fairly early on that any ambitions I had to change the world through being elected as a Member of Parliament were probably not going to be deliverable in the short or medium term. But things at a local level in terms of helping individuals, we reckon that in my time as a Member of Parliament, I probably dealt with something like 150,000 cases. Wow. That's 150,000 individual cases.
Wow.
And many of those, not all of them, but many of those were resolved satisfactorily. And sometimes that meant things like perhaps someone who had been underpaid their benefits by £10,000 suddenly got £10,000 in their bank account, which I'm pretty confident they wouldn't have got if they had been left to their own devices and hadn't sort of enlisted the support of their Member of Parliament. Sometimes it's things like securing a very substantial increase in the grants that Sutton Council got from central government. This happened a number of years ago, where for some reason the formula that central government had drawn up that it used to determine how much each local authority, each local council was going to get towards the cost of their services, this formula had, on almost every single parameter that was used, disadvantaged Sutton in the way that it had not done so for any other local authority literally in the country. Wow. So I took a delegation, I think with Paul Burstow, the MP for Sutton and Cheam then, up to government and said to the Minister in charge of local government, look, and supported by the local councillors who had got the council officers to work through this formula, and said to the Minister, look, surely you accept that it's not right that Sutton gets so much less than a neighbouring borough like Kingston, where really the demand, the needs are pretty similar. And eventually the government agreed that actually there was a quirk in the formula, and we got literally millions of pounds more given following that intervention, and millions of pounds more for the borough. That has a substantial impact, or had a substantial impact on what the borough could do for local people.
So talking about, the campaigns that you were involved in locally, because you mentioned there that sometimes you have to play a bit of the long game, so it's not just a short-term fix. Because you had the longevity to run with projects, was there anything from that sort of has been successful that you would say?
Well, I would argue that the mere fact that St Helier is still there and operating as a hospital with almost the full range of services is a credit to the campaigns that I was involved with, local councillors were involved with, residents were involved with, patient groups were involved with. Had we not maintained that level of campaigning, I'm absolutely certain that hospital would have lost, if not the full range of services, a substantial proportion of them, which, if that had happened, would eventually, I think, have led to the closure of the hospital in any case. We have fought consistently to maintain the level of services at the hospital. We've succeeded so far. And I think, as I said, I think that's because a campaign was carried on over many, many decades, literally, with a series of threats to the hospital that emerged at different times. There was a proposal or a review called Better Services, Better Value, which recommended the closure of St Helier Hospital. When the finances in southwest London have looked difficult for all the hospitals in this patch, because St Helier is located in the centre of Kingston, Croydon, and Epsom Hospital or Sutton Hospital, that has always, and St George's, it has always been vulnerable simply because of its location. But we've managed to fight that off. We've managed to maintain services there. And of course, the most recent thing to happen a couple of years ago was that following an agreement between the local council and central government over the way that money the council had given the hospital given the hospital trust because they had bought land from the hospital trust, following an agreement with the government, that money was allowed to be kept in the Epsom and St Helier Trust and spent on St Helier Hospital. So in the last couple of years, people have seen a very significant amount of scaffolding up around the hospital. And that's because there was this agreement to keep that money local. Whereas in the past, what has happened is if a hospital trust has sold land, then the money that's been raised has simply gone into the Treasury, and the Treasury have decided to spend it in whatever way they see as fit, but not normally on local hospital services. So that was a real win and has ensured that St Helier Hospital, certainly in terms of the structure of the building, is viable for at least another 30 years. I think architecturally it has some challenges, but it's certainly a very visible building and certainly plays a central role in this community, and something that, I was struck by when I went into schools and asked children, hands up if you were born at St Helier Hospital, what a high percentage of children at our local schools were born there.
Yeah, I was born there, so I'm very...
Well, indeed, my children were born there.
Brilliant. So what prompted you to move to Carshalton? Because I don't think you weren't from here originally, were you? You grew up...
No, I can't claim to have been an original resident, although I suppose having moved here in 1990, I think I can probably claim to be certainly a long-term resident now. Yeah. So I was, wanted to be a Member of Parliament, frankly. And at that time, so this was back in 1989, there were relatively few seats in London where a Liberal Democrat stood a chance of getting elected. And the London Borough of Sutton, and more specifically the Carshalton and Wallington seats, was one of those seats that I thought would be winnable, because we already then had more councillors in the constituency than either the Conservatives or Labour. And I thought it had potential. I didn't think we could win it in what transpired to be the 1992 general election. But I thought we could win it in 2 terms, and we did, in fact, win it in 1997.
Wow. I remember the 97 election. I was quite young then, but that was sort of the first time that I actually took a bit more notice of politics generally. And that was obviously Tony Blair's famous victory. Yeah. I remember staying up all night with a huge bar of chocolate to kind of fuel me through, and I made it to like 3 a.m. with the results still coming in. It's not a tradition that I've kept up over the years, but it's quite exciting nonetheless. Well, what must that have been like for you? Where was the count held? Was it Westcroft or something like that?
Yes. Westcroft is the usual location for the counts of general elections.
Yeah.
Well, what it was like for me actually was quite bizarre, because I had spent 7 years campaigning to get elected as the Member of Parliament, but really I had not thought about, in practice, what does that actually mean? If you do get elected, what do you do? And my impression was, I guess like lots of people, that what Members of Parliament do is they sit in the chamber of the House of Commons 5 days a week, debating, sometimes making farmyard noises at each other, and that's what the life of a Member of Parliament is. But in practice, I found out pretty soon, and when I was elected was the first time I had been to Parliament, or certainly the first time I'd been into the chamber, was that in fact what you see on television, particularly the Wednesday Prime Minister's questions, is very much the exception. Most of what happens in Parliament, it either isn't in the chamber at all, because it's committee meetings, it's meeting residents, it's meeting businesses who want to talk about business problems and so on. And most of the things that do happen in the chamber are not actually about Members of Parliament shouting at each other. Normally, there is a degree of consensus, not for all bills that go through the House Commons, but a lot of the bills, there is common sense, and there is a decent exchange, not necessarily agreement, but a decent exchange without the need for people to yaboo and hurl abuse at each other.
Is there any sort of real feelings of true animosity, or is it simply just a kind of heat of the moment thing, or do you go back into a bar and have a beer afterwards and discuss it, or I don't know, how does that work?
Well, that depends, I think, on individuals. There are some Members of Parliament from other parties that I worked quite well with, quite closely with on different issues, that we shared common ground on things like human rights. Human rights, particularly human rights, for instance, abroad, isn't something that has a particular sort of party political nature to it. But there are other members of Parliament, frankly, who I very definitely not want to share a beer with, and would go miles out of my way to avoid sharing a beer with, because their views are beyond the pale as far as I'm concerned. I guess I'm afraid that I'm sure you don't want to talk about Brexit, but Brexit, I think, really polarised Parliament in a way that I'm not sure whether it has recovered from yet, or will recover from. But what was interesting about it is that it polarised it, but at the same time, I ended up working with members of Parliament from 6 other political parties during that period. So, yes, it did polarise people in very, very, with a real gulf between the two camps. But those who were in the same camp, actually, party politics or party allegiance was completely set aside to enable us to work together, members of the Scottish National Party, the Plaid, the Welsh Nationalists, the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, the independent group for change, the group who left the Conservative and Labour parties, and indeed for a period the Conservative MPs, the ones who were eventually thrown out of the Conservative Party, but while they were members of the Conservative Party, we were working with them as well. And those relationships were quite productive and positive.
Wow, that's amazing. Such a great insight. I wanted to ask you, Tom, because I noticed that you actually held also some additional roles and responsibilities in the party. And these sound like very sort of archaic names that sort of plucked out the air. So I want to run a few of them by you. And I just want you to just explain briefly your role within that and your experience and what you did. So first of all, the Lord Commissioner of Her Majesty's Treasury. What's that all about?
Well, I think that's a very grand title that probably doesn't quite reflect the role. And you're probably going to ask me about being a Privy Councillor as well. And the latter, Privy Councillor, if people have seen the film The King's Speech, there's a scene in that where all the Privy Councillors get together and they hold a meeting to decide who the next monarch is going to be. So the fact that I'm a Privy Councillor, that is the only thing, well, with one exception, that's the only thing that because I'm a Privy Councillor, will be involved with in the future, potentially. The only other thing that I get by being a Privy Councillor is the fact that I have higher security clearance. So there are things that I can ask to see, such as there was a report, for instance, that was produced by the security services on infiltration of organisations in the UK, particularly those with more extreme sort of jihadi views. And because I was a Privy Councillor, I was able to go into a room, open a sealed package, read the report, and then it was taken away from me. I wasn't allowed to leave the room with it, but that Privy Councillor was what that means. So often these titles, whether it's Lord Commissioner or Privy Councillor, the title is often more grandiose than the role.
Okay, well, certainly the next one, Deputy Leader of the House of Commons. That also sounds like there's a lot of responsibility there.
Yeah, and again, I think that's that role. So it was a ministerial position. So because I was the Deputy Leader, I was a minister in the coalition government for 3 years. The role was really a dual role. So it was a ministerial role with some responsibility for taking through bills. So often a minister, what they do is there'll be a piece of legislation, perhaps something that was in a manifesto that the government of the day, or in our case, the coalition government, wanted to deliver. The piece of legislation, or a couple of pieces of legislation that I was involved with, were around transparency issues and things like lobbying. So I was the minister who took through a proposal to create a register of lobbyists so that people get more transparency of who was a lobbyist and what they were doing and how much they were earning through doing it. And so as a minister, I took that legislation through. But the role was also about the leader of the House and the deputy leader are the people who, in effect, manage the way the work is scheduled through Parliament. We have to make sure that it sort of, the bills go through smoothly, that there aren't bottlenecks, that the bills are fit for purpose when they come to Parliament, that they aren't full of problems that are going to blow up in the government's face as soon as they arrive in the Commons. So that was the role.
So how do you manage, because that seems like just a full-time job within itself. So how then do you manage that with your sort of day-to-day constituency responsibilities?
Well, there's no doubt that it is much harder to devote as much time as I would have. It was much harder to devote as much time as I wanted to the constituency, because you've got a ministerial responsibilities as well. The only way that perhaps I was able to do it is because the role of deputy leader isn't comparable to being Secretary of State for Education or indeed Minister of State for Education. It's less intense in terms of the time that's involved, and compared to, say, a minister at the Foreign Office, he or she be expected to spend a lot of time abroad. The Deputy of the House of Commons, the minister responsible for lobbying legislation, didn't have to go abroad at all. So, or travel. If you're a minister at the Department of Transport or Environment, the chances are you're going to be travelling quite a lot in the UK as well. And again, that didn't apply. So I think that made it a little bit easier to manage than some of the other ministerial portfolios would have done.
Wow, that's amazing. Finally, the last title I got on my notes here was Party Chief Whip, which sounds interesting. What does a Party Chief Whip do?
Yeah, so a lot of people will have a vision of what a Chief Whip does based on that TV series House of Cards, for instance, where what the Chief Whip does is the Chief Whip has a book which has a list of all the misdemeanours that MP committed when they're on some foreign trip somewhere with someone who wasn't their spouse. Okay. And then when a difficult vote comes up, the Chief Whip calls up that Member of Parliament and says, "Oh, I hear you were thinking of not voting with the government. Can I just remind you that when you were last in Brazil, this happened. Are you sure you still want to vote against the government?" Now, that, when I was Chief Whip, I can assure you never ever happened. I didn't have a black book with little details of people's personal lives that I could use as leverage to encourage them to vote with the government or with the party. No, so the Chief Whip does, yes, of course, try to encourage members of his or her political party to vote for the party, because they're elected as members of the party. They're elected on a manifesto, on a political platform. And apart from certain issues of conscience, things like abortion and euthanasia, for instance, where there isn't necessarily a party line at all and people can vote in the way that they want, most of the time members of Parliament are expected to vote in the way that the party manifesto and party policy suggests they should vote. And the Chief Whip is there to remind people and to try to encourage people who have problems with what is party policy to talk them through why that is what we agreed. And if that fails, then the Chief Whip's role would then be to say, well, look, if you really, really feel very strongly about this, it would be far preferable for you to stay in your constituency and go and meet that school group that you wanted to meet, or do anything but come into Parliament to vote against the party line, because it never helps a political party to be disunited. So but there's also a pastoral role in that clearly members of Parliament, like anyone else in any other field of employment or professions, sometimes will have personal problems, will have health problems, things that really where they want to sit down and talk to the Chief Whip about those. Perhaps negotiate not being in Parliament because they don't feel up to it at that particular moment in time, and that's a role for the Chief Whip. And finally, the Chief Whip is also the person who will talk to and to some extent negotiate with the Chief Whips in the other parties, because if we want to have a debate as an opposition party, very often the only way to do that is by negotiation with the chief whip of the governing party. So there's a number of aspects or facets to the role.
Okay, because so it sounds like part of that was almost like a mentoring role. You say for other
a pastoral role for members of parliament.
Well, was there when you first, so in 1997, taking it back, you walked into the House of Commons for the first time, which I imagine must have been, I don't know, overwhelming. Maybe for you it wasn't, I don't know. But was there anyone in your party who you looked up to, someone who was really supportive and kind of helped you ease into that situation?
Well, I mean, there were people who I looked up to. So when I first got involved in a general election campaign, it was with Simon Hughes, who was the MP for Southwark and Bermondsey, a long-standing, he was at one point the longest-standing Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament in Parliament with me. Subsequently, that was a role that I had. I was, until December last year, the longest-serving Lib Dem MP in Parliament. So I looked up to Simon, but in terms of formal structures to inductions, in the way that if you work for a company, you'd expect to have some sort of induction program on day 1 and day 2 and day 3 and so on. Certainly not back in 1997. I mean, things have improved since, but what happened to me in the first 3 months of being a member of Parliament back in 1997 is that I had no staff, no desk, no telephone, and spent the first 3 months wandering round the House of Commons with plastic bags full of correspondence, and it was only because my wife was on maternity leave that I was able to get some sort of secretarial support or administrative support in the initial phases until I managed to get an office, a desk, a telephone. But it did take a long time to sort of catch up with that, what happened in those first sort of 3 months without any support. And of course, what happens, and I suspect my successor may have found this, what happens when you get elected as a new member of Parliament is that a lot of people who have previously raised an issue with your predecessor and perhaps not managed to come to a satisfactory outcome will now approach the new member of Parliament, because it's someone new, and say, well, this is my case. I think you can resolve it now. And so I think there's an extra sort of boost to the number of people who want to make contact with the new MP. And it wasn't just members of the public wishing me well and congratulating me on getting elected for the first time.
Just going back then to your sort of keen to sort of delve into your experiences and your history of Parliament. Do you remember your first maiden speech? Well, not your maiden speech, which would have been your
well,
first.
Indeed, my first maiden speech was my first speech. That's the definition of maiden speech. Yeah, well, I do remember it quite well, and I remember it, I suppose, in some ways for negative reasons, because what happened was, because in 1997, as you said earlier, it was the first Tony Blair government, and it was a huge change in the number of MPs of the different parties. So there was a huge churn, which meant that there were hundreds of MPs, new MPs, who wanted to make a maiden speech. So it took a very long time for everyone to make their maiden speech.
Okay.
And I was told on 3 separate occasions that this was the debate in which I was going to make my maiden speech. So 3 separate debates. I turned up with my speech, sat there for, I don't know, I think I worked out it was about 11 hours in the end, I think. Okay. And sat there with my maiden speech, listening to other maiden speeches, looking at my speech and thinking, well, that's the 3rd time I've heard someone use that phrase, so I better scrub that out. So it got rewritten about 4 or 5 times before I eventually made it. Okay. And a friend of mine who, I mean, I've forgiven him because I've known him since we were about 8 or 9. I sent him a copy of it, and he said, well, frankly, this is rubbish. Well, I don't think it was rubbish. but it wasn't as polished as it might have been had I been able just to make it, as opposed to sitting there sweating. Because, of course, when you're trying to make a speech in the chamber, what you have to do is you have to stand up and sit down every time a speaker has finished speaking to indicate to the speaker that you want to be called. So it's 11 hours and standing up and sitting down probably every 10, 15 minutes. So it's quite a nerve-wracking experience to do your maiden speech in those circumstances. So I let myself off a little bit for not having delivered a maiden speech that Winston Churchill would have been proud of.
But it's mad to think that you're sort of, you're in the footsteps of, great political leaders of the past. And, Churchill is obviously someone that springs to mind. Did you ever get that sense that when you were, walking around the corridors of Parliament, that there was this kind of this real historical significance to what you were, playing a part in?
Yes, and that was sort of reinforced every time I took a group of people into the chamber, which I'd often do, either perhaps accompanying a school group or perhaps some friends who were coming in, and pointing out to them that, apart from the fact there is a statue of Churchill in the members' lobby, pointing out the war damage, the Second World War damage at the entrance to the chamber of the House of Commons, which is left there deliberately as a reminder, and then taking them into the chamber and pointing out the Speaker's chair, the dispatch boxes, and explaining that those were provided by Commonwealth countries. I think the Speaker's chair is Australia, Jamaica provided things, Canada provided things, and that is because during the Second World War, the House of Commons chamber was bomb damaged, and members of Parliament were moved down to the House of Lords to sit in the House of Lords. So yes, not only the statue of Winston Churchill, but the bomb damage, the fact that the chamber was partially demolished during the Second World War, I think adds to that feeling of this being a historic place where great characters have spoken at times of huge crisis for the country. And I'm afraid I'm not going to draw parallels between Winston Churchill's performances and Boris Johnson's.
I wasn't going to ask you. Talking of, great moments of rhetoric, there was one particular moment that sprung to mind as I was researching this, and it was something I wanted to ask if you remembered was, I know it's a different party, but Robin Cook's resignation speech. Were you around for that?
Yes, I was. And clearly those are the occasions that people will remember. Occasions where a member of Parliament has felt the need to walk away from their political party. There were a number of those. There was an occasion more recently when Nick Bowles, who was a Conservative member of Parliament, decided to cross the floor. In other words, he was saying, I'm no longer a Conservative member of Parliament. And he was in the middle of making his speech, explaining why he was about to cross the floor. And unfortunately for him, at that very moment, up in the public gallery, there were some demonstrators. I think they were, they might have been Extinction Rebellion or PETA, the people against the fur trade, who stripped off almost completely, not completely, fortunately, but almost completely in the public gallery. So what should have been his, the moment where really he came across, with the gravitas and the angst and his pouring his heart out as to why he felt he could no longer stay in the Conservative Party, was all slightly tarnished by what was happening in the public gallery above his head.
Oh wow! So I'm sure you have many memories besides these that we've spoken of. But
I'll give you one other example, and that is in the chamber with Tony Blair, Prime Minister's questions, Tony Blair standing up speaking, and this was the famous incident involving Fathers for Justice. So some Fathers for Justice demonstrators were up in the public gallery, and this was before they're in this section of the public gallery that wasn't behind or isn't behind a screen. So they were able to, during the course of Tony Blair speaking, they're able to throw a piece of chalk, a piece of purple chalk, sort of flew across, down from the gallery, hit Tony Blair on the back. And I was sitting opposite him. So this was in, obviously, they were in government, and we, the Lib Dems, were in opposition. I was sitting opposite and saw this sort of from the corner of my eye coming down and hitting him on the back. I thought it was someone let off a firework, a purple firework. But it was then quite strange in that the proceedings carried on as if nothing had happened for a few minutes. Then the Speaker of the day stopped the proceedings, and nobody really knew what to do. Okay. And eventually we all left the chamber, and quite rightly afterwards, the commentary was, well, this was at a time when there were lots of threats with ricin powder. People were in different parts of the world, were receiving in packages white powder that most of the time wasn't ricin, but very occasionally was, which is a highly poisonous chemical, or based, I think, on you make it from beans, I think kidney beans or something, not quite sure how. And what should have happened is that everyone should have been contained in the chamber while someone worked out whether this was potentially a contaminant of some sort, so that rather than us all leaving and spreading it, if it was, we should have been contained until someone checked. But that's not what happened. We just sort of left. And that was not a very good example, I think, of management of a potentially dangerous situation in the chamber.
Yeah, sure. Because I guess if that happened now, perhaps not during lockdown, but if, as things have changed and tensions have heightened over the years, I expect that would be much a higher profile incident.
Yes, I imagine someone would have worked through what to do in that scenario and have a plan of action that was promptly implemented, as opposed to everyone scratching their heads and wondering what to do next.
Tom, I think our time has finally come to a close. I just want to say thank you so much for sharing all of your experiences and anecdotes. It's been so interesting and so insightful, and really appreciate all the work you've done, and all the best for the future.
Great. Pleasure. My pleasure.